revolting revolutions.
How revolting.
How revolting and how revolutionary at the same time.
It's a short one.
Good. Well,
I decided I'm through futzing around trying to keep track of my notes and keep track of this. So, okay, one slide's done. I thought about telling I'm going to show this and we're going to talk a long time on it. But to keep track, I've got my Sharpie here and I can mark off on the screen what I did.
may or may not be as successful as we'd hope, but it's worth a shot. But honestly, I mean, again, teaching a course of this scope, right? If you try to teach everything, you can't hope to. So you just find the one thing that you want to focus on and do that, and hope that that kind of grabs the spirit of the age or time or whatever the chapter is. We're doing a good job. Okay, keep source formatting. You got to start. Okay.
Yeah.
That one looks legible. Let's look at this one. Hang it on that. Looks good to me. That also looks good.
Let's expand that, or else
Sure.
change it to that'd be the easiest, because that'll distort it. Just change it to a blank. You come over here.
Over here.
Well,
So what do you see?
to make it a blank slide, so this stuff is, or does that,
Oh, that doesn't show up.
okay,
Good question. Yeah. When we get it up, it'll look like this.
okay, good.
Okay.
Yep.
No. It is the weirdest thing in the world that it keeps those. Like, you didn't put those titles in. It did that. It decided it wanted that.
Yeah, I knew that now that you said that, but I sit there looking at that and said, I don't want that on
I wouldn't either. Yes. Okay. You're up 1648. That looks good. That looks lovely. Looks great. We're in. They all look good to me. Do you feel comfy?
Yep.
All right. You're ready to start it off in 2 minutes or whenever you feel most pleased to do so. Do you want, you like this up front, up here, like this?
Yeah,
Or up to the side? Okay.
Yeah, yeah.
Great. Go get them. Have fun.
We'll dust it off though.
Yes. There you go. Now it's extra beautiful.
Well, good morning, everyone. I'm waiting for you to quit using yours. Sorry about that. That just come from here to there. Anyway, glad to see you all here this fine morning and our march through history. And today's topic is revolt and revolution. And we're going to be talking about these are in two different chapters in the book, and mainly it's the political revolt or political revolution and the industrial revolution, and what were their impacts, what was happening in these two eras that happened, and how do they impact us today is the main thrust of what it is. Now, the political revolution that started the French Revolution, it saw Christianity pretty much displaced from French history, but it didn't achieve a total removal, but it did create an atmosphere of instability amongst the church people in France. And it also the French Revolution started revolutionary movements throughout Europe. And these movements were to repeat. That's an L, not a T. They sought to repeat the success of the French. And this created serious difficulties pretty much across Europe for the churches in the many parts of Europe. But in the Industrial Revolution, it was of a different nature, and it brought a lot of the people from the villages into the towns and cities and the factories. But the churches, they couldn't ignore this new problems that was caused. And what these new problems is people moving from the villages into the cities and not enough houses or rooms into the cities. And the rapid rise of these numbers of workers moving in, they created some problems in these industrializing countries such as France, Britain, and Germany. We're going to start off talking about the European Revolt. By the end of the 18th century, revolution was in the air pretty much in the whole, well, actually pretty much in the European world, including America. Because the American colonists had just declared their independence from Britain, and a dozen or so years later, the French Revolution erupted into France, throwing that monarchy that had been ruling for centuries out. And these events set the scenes for other people that was disgusted or are not too happy with their government to say, well, we can do the same thing. So this French Revolution and that destruction that followed it, of course, as any movement does, it did bring a strong conservative reaction against it, because there's always two sides of every discussion or two sides of every thought. And most of this century, the 18th century, we're talking about the 1700s, was characterized by this ongoing battle of ideas between the liberals and the conservatives. Now, we're not talking about today's history, we're talking about the 18th century. And during this period, there has been much change that the church had to deal with, because it often found itself in the center of this war of ideas. And there was church leaders that opposed these changes. There was church leaders that wanted to ignore these changes, and there was church leaders that embraced these changes. Well, let's just start talking about where it started up in Europe. Next week, they're going to be talking about this same topic, I believe, in America. So we're centering on Europe and in the Industrial Revolution there. This is pretty much a quote out of one of the history books we'd had, and I just think I can read that so I don't mess it up. The Bastille. The French Revolution begins. On the eastern edge of Paris stood an old feudal fortress, long used as a prison, a symbol of royal tyranny. Languishing in its dungeons were supposed to be many virtuous defenders of the oppressed people. Governor Delaunay commanded the Bastille with a garrison of 110 soldiers. Early in the morning of July 14th, 1789, a crowd gathered in a small square before the prison's outer gate. As it grew in numbers and excitement, the people started pushing toward the gates. Some patriots climbed over the fence and cut the chains to the drawbridge, giving the attackers access to the outer court. Seeing the condition that they were in, the governor agreed to surrender the fortress in exchange for the safe withdrawal of him and his men. But as soon as the gates to the inner court were opened, the attackers swept in, seized Delaunay, and murdered him. Now, they didn't say what happened to those 110 men. Probably the same. Where was I? The dungeons. They got into and released the dungeons. They yield 7 supposed victims of tyranny. No innocent political prisoners. The prisoners, there was 4 counterfeiters, 2 psychiatric patients, and 1 aristocrat that was detained there at his family's request. No vast number of incarcerated patriots to be freed. However, those sordid facts that we just read of July 14th, 1789 were speedily transformed into the heroic deeds of the French Revolution. I would sub-comment the power of the press. Anyway, we're moving on to item B, the birth of the new age. The historians looked at this event in France as the birth of this new age, and this age they call the age of progress, pretty much from 1789 through 1914. And this Bastille, as I said earlier, was a symbol of that old regime, a symbol of the absolute rule of the monarchs and of this traditional feudal society. And that society, traditional feudal society, consisted of the church, the wealthy aristocrats, and everybody else. That's what society consisted of back in that time. And that crowd out in front, they was a symbol of this new age, this new progression, and demands for the rights of everybody else. See, the popular belief in the crowd was that this was the beginning of progress toward a better world. Even though the tumult, the bloodshed, the rioting raised some ethical questions amongst some of the people, few doubted that history was indeed moving ever onward and upward, and our human race was getting closer and closer to growing better and being happier. At any rate, that was the mantra that was put out at that time. And swept up by currents and cross currents, Christians found it hard to know which side of this do we need to be on, which way do we need to go. The Protestants felt the impact of the changes, but they weren't the bullseye of the target of these changes that was coming in, because while they were part of Christendom, they really weren't part of that Catholic Christianity that was the dominant force in the elite. But the Catholic Church, it found many of its privileges, its authorities, its advantages being swept away by this tide that's coming in. And the Catholic Church struck back, as she had always done, by doubling down on the authority of the church and the Pope. See, the democratic gospel that was being spread during the French Revolution, it really rested upon more on the glorification of man than upon the glorification of God. And in resting on that gospel of the common man, the Catholic Church, resisting it, they tried to turn back the clock. Let's just go back to the way things were. That was pretty nice. A quote from the book: "She tried to erect a fortress on the road of progress, and the masses of secular people simply just passed by on the other side." The Catholic Church saw more than the Protestant churches did that the devil, if it's to his advantage, will become democratic. You see, 10,000 people telling a lie don't make that lie the truth. And that's an important lesson, hopefully, that we have learned through the years and continue to learn. Just because the majority says so does not make it so. And the freedom to vote and the chance to get an education doesn't indicate the arrival of utopia. See, the process of government, the rule of the majority, can often mean the oppression of the minority. Relinquishing control to the fickle mood of the majority rather than to the reasoned leadership isn't really progress of any sort. So with that, some seeds of the revolution were already planted and were starting to sprout and grow. Before the French Revolution, as I said earlier, the church had basked in the glory of the old order. For thousands of years, she had sanctified the society of feudal Europe. She gave blessings to the rule of the kings and to the marriage of the nobles, giving little thought to the powerless peasants and the growing middle class. Noble birth, holy calling were of a better, more important and greater consequence than anything about intelligence, achievement, or accumulation of wealth. See, the nobility and the clergy at that time made up about 20% of the population, but they, in fact, controlled nearly half the land and all of the positions of government. And the peasants were staggering under the load of taxes, heavy taxes, including both taxes to the state and taxes to the church. And the middle class they had wealth without responsibility, and they had intelligence without authority, and they had the ability without recognition. See, this middle class was starting to grow. Remember, a couple of weeks ago we talked about the increase of trade. It wasn't the nobleman going to get on them boats and go swap goods with the natives. It was that middle class that was growing at this time. And France, in all of its wars and all of its things that it was involved with, it had borrowed great sums of money from the European bankers, and to cover it over so that nobody really knew about it, they had falsified records to hide the state of finances from the people. In addition, the people saw this high living amongst the church officials and the government officials, and there was a series of bad harvests amongst the major industry of France, the wine industry. This all contributed to this atmosphere of restlessness between the haves and the have-nots. Growing tension coming. So we come to point D, where the revolution fever spreads. Not only in France, but country after country felt this fever of political unrest. Radical politicians challenged the established order, and they basically all had the same demands. They wanted the right to participate in the politics and the government. They wanted the right to vote, and they wanted the right for greater freedom for the expression, including their expression of faith. France's King Louis the XVI, that'd be 16th, he tried to cool off this fever by convening this thing called the Estates General, and basically, I think, passing off the problem to them. But what the Estates General was this was an assembly of the three traditional divisions of the French government: the clergy, the nobility, and the common people, or as Ed said earlier, everybody else. Controversy sprang up immediately when this group met together to try to solve the problem, because this group had not met for over 175 years previously, because the king took care of everything because he was the absolute ruling authority, and the powers of this body, even though it had been established, had never been really clearly defined. They didn't have it set out who's to do what to whom and when. Well, as they started going, the clergy and the nobles, that's two of those three estates, they wanted, let's have one vote per estate. Indeed, that would make counting of the ballot a whole lot easier, but it also would give these guys an immediate majority. The common people weren't that common and weren't that dumb. They wanted one vote per person in the assembly, and that they felt comfortably would give them the majority. So they took this proposal to the king, and he rejected it. So they says, okay, we're going to leave the Estates General Assembly and go form our own National Assembly. I thought that was an interesting highlight of how to solve your difficulties. Take your ball and go home. Well, back to the Bastille, when the mob stormed that, it became clear that the crown would no longer able to control the people. From then on, the populace, or the people, really needed to be considered a viable political force, something that had to be dealt with one way or the other. And at the end of 1789, most of the French aristocracy's traditional privileges had been wiped out, and they passed a new law entitled Declaration of the Rights of Man and of the Citizen, possibly somewhat similar to our Constitution. Well, to summarize up, in 10 brief years before this century ended, France had accomplished several things. It had formed a republic, it had executed its king, it established an effective revolutionary machinery or engine, and it had gone through this period of confusion that followed it, and all that came to an end with Napoleon's rise to power. And through it all, the French nation was continually doing battle with all the other countries in the continent because they wanted to control and rule the entirety of Europe. So what did the revolution, as I said earlier, kind of zeroed in specifically on the Catholic Church because of its dominant and important part that it had into the old order. The revolutionaries made this church a specific target of their rage. The National Assembly, that group of commoners that broke off from the Estates General, they attempted to reform the Catholic Church along the lines of the Enlightenment period. And the Assembly eliminated all control of the French Church by the Pope and imposed loyalty oaths upon the priests, on the church officers. And this split the church into two. One, those that took the oath, and two, those that refused to take the oath. And you can imagine the ensuing chaos that followed, people being put into hiding, exported, maybe even killed. But this kind of illustrates the Catholicism versus liberalism viewpoint. And the idea was everybody thought everyone ought to be as free as possible. This idea was in the air. But what does as free as possible entail? John Stuart Mill wrote, "The liberty of each is limited by the like liberty for all." So liberty meant the right to have your own opinions, the right to propagate or try to spread those opinions, and the right to behave according to those opinions, subject to a similar freedom for each and every other member of the community. This meant that a government would have to guarantee civil liberties to all, including the freedom to worship according to your personal choice. And of course, the Catholic popes despised this thought. They weren't in favor of this kind of freedom at all. Now, all through these years, those popes that we're talking about weren't bad men. They just simply refused to join the 19th century or the 17th, 8th. They simply refused to join the crowd. They continued to defend the past, and they lost touch with what was going on around them. They weren't paying attention. None of them really understood this new age, this age of progress that was introduced by the French Revolution, and they never figured out how to fight it or how to convert it. They just chose to ignore it. And also, not only the church, but in Napoleon's collapse, the kings decided this is time to move back in and pick up the ground that we've lost so far. And the return to the monarchies also had stiff resistance from the liberal groups all over Europe, not just in France. See, the liberalism proposed to overthrow the evils that affected mankind, including the oppressive monarchy. In the battle, it didn't want any assistance from the church, and it insisted that the church had no right to express its own views on the morality of the public. See, their idea was, and by the church, you're usually implying the Roman Catholic Church. The Roman Catholics are private citizens with the rights of private citizens and nothing more. They're not special because of the particular church they belong to. But the interesting thing was after that French Revolution and the difficulties and turmoil of it, there's a particular loyalty to the papacy that started to develop amongst the grassroots of the country. See, they had gone through the Revolution, they had gone through Napoleon, and some of the Catholics felt that the church was the only source of civil order and public morality. And only the popes were capable of restoring their disordered society, and only the clergy or the priests, independent from the state, led by an infallible pope, would have the power and the prestige and the strength to protect our spiritual freedoms from the tyranny of political power. This was kind of the thinking that was going on. And it attracted a sizable following because, well, that makes sense. And of course, the Pope, he encouraged this kind of thinking in every possible way. Which led to an act that he did in 1854. He declared as dogma or as church official policy that traditional belief that had been introduced earlier, that Mary had been conceived without original sin. That's called the Immaculate Conception. Well, I think I talked about that a couple of weeks back, but that was just a feeling or thought or tradition that had been introduced, but in 1854, Pius IX, he declared, this is it, this is our official policy. Now, it wasn't that a new concept was being presented. As I'd said, it had already been raised up, and it was the way it was presented. It was not a decision by a church council, but an independent declaration of the Pope. So questions started coming up within the Catholic Church on all sides. Can the Pope alone, without council, decide and proclaim church dogma, church beliefs, church rules? That was the main topic of this First Vatican Council that Pius called. And the concept itself didn't cause any difficulties. As I said earlier, the idea had been presented and kind of filtered through the people and accepted. Yes, Mary was conceived without original sin, but the question is really, how far does that Pope's authority go? Can it be expressed independent from the councils, from this College of Bishops? And if there's are there any preconditions before the Pope can make such a sweeping statement of this on his own? Well, after some hassling and arguing and taking of votes and sending people home that didn't vote the right way, the council passed or accepted the Pope's proclamation, and doing so set into motion two fundamental truths within the church itself, not capital T truths. First, since the Pope was a successor to Peter, the apostle, he exercised full and direct authority over the whole of Christendom. Second, when the Pope makes a decision, it's infallible, immutable, and doesn't require the consent of the church. This decision has shaped the lives of Roman Catholics for generations to come. You see, surrounded by the hostile forces as the Catholic Church was of liberalism, of socialism, of nationalism, they chose to withdraw behind the fortress walls of an exalted and infallible Pope. Fortresses do have disadvantages. They grow stuffy. They don't allow any enlargement of thinking. And after a time, you start to imagine that the only world of any importance is that world that's within these walls. We're moving to F, reorganization of the European continent. The Enlightenment and the Revolutionary Wars provoked a new wave of thinking in Europe. And at the same time, the monarchs, the old kings, that they felt their only hope was going to be in reasserting their divine ordained rule in their divine bestowed countries. And to do that, they would have to restore the authority of the church to grant and support that divine ordination. So in 1815, those great powers got together and established the borders and governments of the New Europe at the Congress of Vienna. Now, when I read that and saw the map of the New Europe, I thought, wait a minute, we're changing maps here now. I had to announce it because you may not recognize it. To me, I'm not seeing a whole lot of difference, except maybe some of the colors, between the maps of 1815 and the map of 1648. I think they did it with smoke and mirrors. But anyway, back to our list. G, the barricades start crumbling. The year 1848 was a monumental year in European history because that's what they call the year of the revolt. There's first some rumblings. There were some liberal uprisings in Spain and Italy, but these were easily suppressed because Spain was predominantly Catholic, and of course Italy was also. But the success that the people of France had at overturning their king gave some other countries, the people in other countries, hope that, hey, there is a possibility of change out here. Maybe we can have it. So then comes what they call the turbulent year of 1848. That's when the liberal revolution temporarily triumphed, and say temporarily, in almost every capital in Europe. And it was one of Europe's most turbulent years with revolutionary uprisings in numerous countries with varying results. And just have a few examples. In Switzerland, 7 Catholic states succeeded from the Swiss Confederation after the liberals protested the reassertion of the church roles in their lives. The Catholic rebels were quickly defeated and a new constitution was introduced, giving the men the vote and guaranteeing freedom of religion. And in France, even in addition to the Bastille, barricades were erected in the streets, a provisional government was proclaimed, the king fled to England. This one got away with his head in place. And presidential elections resulted in the election of Napoleon's nephew, Louis. But Louis soon dissolved the legislature and proclaimed himself emperor. So, round 2 for those poor Frenchmen trying to get a republic going. In Prussia, many had hoped that their ruler, Frederick Wilhelm IV, would be open to political reform, but when they presented him a proposed constitution, he rejected it. Street fighting erupted in Berlin, and the king backed up, lost his nerve, and promised immediate concessions. They published the Declaration to the Rights of the German People. Similar sounding title, isn't it? Granting freedom of religion. But as in France, that revolt wouldn't be long lasting because by 1850, the new institutions promised to them by Wilhelm had vanished, and by 1951, that famous Declaration of Rights was annulled. We undid that law. In Austria, the government went on the offensive with troops shooting a number of protesters in Vienna. Now, Austria was a strong Catholic country. But shooting those protesters only inflamed the situation, and soon the emperor bowed to the inevitable, and he dismissed his extremely conservative chancellor and introduced some modest reforms. In Italy, it was a little more complicated because Italy had a lot of separate states. Some of them had kings, some of them had emperors. But in the middle of Italy was these things called papal states. And that king and emperor was, of course, the Pope. Pius IX did make some reforms for the papal states. Initially, he thought, hey, this guy's coming over to our side, and we're going to finally be able to unite Italy with into one nation. There were some new concessions in the northern states of Piedmont and Tuscany, Naples in the south, and the papal states. New concessions, giving them some more liberty, more freedom. And in Venice, they forced out the Austrian troops, and a republic was declared into Venice, while much of the area of Lombard rose against the Austrian rule. And the Pope seemed to support these efforts. At least he didn't denounce them. And many people took this Pope's stance on this as support for a united Italy. But when the other northern states started showing a willingness to support Venice against Catholic Austria, the Pope changed his mind. And he repudiated entirely the idea of Italy becoming united and instructed the Catholics, you remain loyal to your existing rulers. You don't switch horses in the middle of the stream. And that announcement he made was received with such anger into Rome that he was forced to leave the city in disguise so he would make it out of the city. Well, in the course of time, the Austrians did regain their authority in Northern Europe, and the Pope called on his buddies over in France for help. And Louis Napoleon, remember the guy that got elected, Napoleon's nephew, in an effort to win support of the French Catholics in his country, and also a fear of Australia becoming a dominant power into Italy, he sent help to the Pope and took back Rome. So when the Pope returned, it was clear that, you know, you're not the liberal guy we thought you were going to be. You're not the guy that we thought was going to be wanting to unite Italy. So he lost his support. But popular support for uniting Italy was so strong, there was little the Pope really could do at that time to oppose it or make it not happen in the long term. See, again, he tried to reverse revolutionary changes. He had this fear, the events of the 1848 to 50s, those 2 years, the year of wars, put a fear of contemporary world into the Pope and its New Age thinking. And just as the European leaders earlier, remember the maps, had tried to reverse the changes of the revolution, the Pope tried to turn back the clock into the cultural or Christian revolution. And his reaction to this loss of power, again, was to emphasize his spiritual infallibility. He issued this document called the Syllabus of Errors. He listed a whole bunch of the all-inclusive list of all the errors in the modern world. Some of them condemned the emergence of political liberalism. He denied that the church should reconcile itself to it, to deal with it, to let it happen. He reinstated the supremacy of the Catholic Church, even over other denominations and secular law. The Catholic Church was to be superior, and he denied the right to dispute papal authority. There's no court of appeals, folks. Once I've decided it, it's it. And he forbid civil marriages. Marriage is a ceremony that's going to be done in the Catholic Church, and that's the only place. Well, those actions were opposed in Germany, France, and Britain, 3 of the major players in the continent at that time. Which brings us to number H, specifically Germany, Bismarck's Germany. He was called the Iron Chancellor, and he launched a campaign of reducing the political influence of the Christian minority in Germany at that time and subject the Catholic Church to strict state controls. It was called a Kulturkampf, German for culture struggle. It was a fierce political and ideological conflict between Pope Pius and Chancellor Bismarck. So what were some of these reforms? Just to give a flavor of what the Bismarck did. His administration passed a series of laws to strip the church of its traditional powers. One of them was called the Pulpit Law, prohibiting members of the clergy from preaching about political matters or criticizing the government from the pulpit. Can't do that anymore. School Inspection Act. He abolished the church oversight of the schools, placing all public and religious education under strict state control. He expulsion of the Jesuits. He banned and dissolved the Jesuit order across the German Empire, viewing them as papal agents. And he passed a thing called the May Laws, and I'm not sure what the May part was about, but it gave the state veto power over church appointments and mandated that the priests be able to pass state exams in literature, history, and philosophy. And compulsory civil marriages. The church was stripped of its monopoly over the marriage registries and made secular civil marriage legally mandatory, and was called the breadbasket law. cut off all subsidies to the Catholic diocese and churchmen who refused to sign that Pledge of Obedience to those state laws. So there are several laws that he had passed just to, and why did he do it? Well, he was concerned about the Catholics in Germany being more loyal to the Vatican than they were to Germany. And when that Pope published his idea of he's infallible, in Germany as well as other places, they saw that as too much intrusion into the secular affairs. And also, the Catholics in Germany formed a political party which started growing and gathering in strength. And these were some of the reasons that he established this Kulturkampf. But the problem was it backfired. Rather than fracturing German Catholicism, it achieved exactly the opposite results. It sparked massive civil disobedience. It brought the Catholic hierarchy and lay people tighter together, more solidarity, if you will. It energized the voters. And remember, I said this Catholic party had formed. They started winning seats in the parliament, and hundreds of priests, as a result of this, being fined, jailed, and exiled, created this atmosphere of martyrism. Instead of them being killed as a punishment, they were elevated to this platform of martyrdom. Well, recognizing the campaign was a political failure, Bismarck said, I need to change my strategy. And I don't know if luckily or not, but the death of that uncompromising Pope Pius and the election of the more diplomatic Pope Leo give him this exit ramp to get out of this thing with. And during the next 7 years, he systematically rolled back and repealed almost all that anti-Catholic legislation, although the state did retain control over the school inspections and civil marriages. See, during this period of time, there was many changes that both for the Catholic and the Protestant denominations to face. Christianity had been forced to acknowledge and deal with the world is changing in philosophy, in science. How do we change with it and still remain true? Universal belief in God was no longer a given, taken for granted, and the citizens are no longer prepared to do what they were told to do because the church told them to do it. They started rationalizing and thinking for themselves, good or bad, but they started doing it, and it had to come to understand, the Catholic Church had to come to understand that it no longer had the monopoly, it no longer had control of belief or morality of the people of its country. And I think it still thought of that church as we are the church of the country, therefore the country is of the church. Remember that thinking way back earlier when the king converted, everybody converted? I think that was kind of hanging around on the time. Protestant churches as well, they had to face a reduction in their role. See, as they pushed the Catholic Church out of the church-state separation idea, the Protestant churches were involved in this as well, and they had to face a detachment from the state and state support. So they were no longer, either the Protestants or the Catholics were no longer able to just simply impose itself on the people or to suppress their opponents. That was no longer an option on the table. Christianity has now become a matter of the individual conscience and not as a state or a church dictate. Industrial Revolution. This is the second revolutionary force that transformed the economy of much of Europe. It began in Britain in the late 18th century and quickly spread to Germany and France. And this industry, what this revolution was, industry attracted workers from the rural lands and brought them into the urban centers and factories. And bringing all these people off the farm into the factory had a result that there was some perceived injustices to these workers that was moving in, housing, accommodations, that kind of stuff, which resulted in strong demands for political reform and or revolution. You're going to either change the way you're treating these folks or we're going to have a fight on our hands, boys. And these social changes help to popularize this concept called nationalism, that we are now part of a country rather than part of a kingdom. We see ourselves as being a nation rather than a village. There was a schoolboy that described the Industrial Revolution. He says, well, about 1760, a wave of gadgets swept over England. A little more complicated than that. And it really was a process of a gradual movement rather than a revolution kind of a thing. See, innovations were introduced into the manufacturing process at different times, at different processes, different industries, and even different times or different parts of the same industry when these innovations were brought in. So what was the impact, the introduction of the impact? As I said, these were grassroots changes. The Industrial Revolution wasn't something mandated from the top down. It was something that grew from the bottom up. And it was by consent. Well, at least by consent of the factory owners, which were mostly middle class, and their financiers. They were okay with this. And it was stimulated by this increased markets caused by this increased trade we discussed 3 weeks ago, and the increased population. Instead of people growing and eating their own food on their own farm villages, they were now into town and had to purchase it somewhere, starting more and more commerce going on. And also, technical innovations were needed to make up for that scarcity of appropriate labor in these factories. And one of the things, what a significant breakthrough with these factories was the invention of the steam engine at that time, because now the factories had a permanent source of power and weren't relied onto the climate, the wind power and the water power. They had this steam engine that was there all the time, whether it was windy, cloudy, rainy, or not. But the cost of that steam engine, it set a minimum size that factory would need to be, a scale it need to be cost effective, and it set a minimum efficiency of operation that had to go on in that factory for it to be cost effective. Another thing that come in, the canals and railways also give these factories freedom of where they were going to locate. They didn't have to be in a place of where their raw materials were anymore, or where their market for their finished product was going to be. But there was a tyranny of the machine called from the farm to the factory. Industrialization did bring jobs for these people in the villages that suffered bad harvests, suffered a little bit of poverty, but they really didn't see this as a great advantage. Hatred for the factories was not because of their long hours and their low wages, as sometimes portrayed. Long hours and low wages was a part of farming life. And not just in the Middle Ages either, I can swear to that. Long hours, minimal return, women and children working in the fields to make ends meet. That was a normal part of farming operation. My earlier comment was, I grew up one of 7 kids on a farm, and we were the labor force, which made me realize the importance of getting an education. And also the urban houses, the cramped quarters, the urban houses. I don't know if you've ever been over to see some of those European villages where the houses are stacked in one upon the, not much different than what they had in the what they history books called the slums of the industrial age. What about the slums of the villages? What the problem was is their natural rhythm of life was broken. See, prior to this, the sun and the seasons controlled what they had to do that day, the work they was to accomplish, what needed to be finished. Some days, nothing needed to be finished. rather than the sun and the seasons, they were now controlled by the time clocks and the factory whistles. This is what made the workers of the Industrial Revolution so upset. The emphasis is now on precision, standards, economy, avoidance of waste, rather than this freedom of being out on the farm and stopping and smelling the roses. Somewhat like our back to nature urges we have today, but I don't know if anybody ever really successfully goes back to nature after they've enjoyed what civilized society can offer them. So the churches in industrial England, as people were moving into town, the Church of England was particularly slow to respond to this increased population because it required an act of Parliament to establish a new parish. And both time-consuming and money-consuming to establish a new parish. So these urban masses then grew far beyond the ability of Church of England's ability to reach them and care for them, and there was no room for them in the churches. The churches they had built was to house the people that got into them, and there was no clergy to care for their spiritual needs. This was the Church of England. And the Methodists, meanwhile, with their barn meeting places and their itinerant preachers moving around the country, they were able to go into this area where the Church of England couldn't go, and other denominations beside the Methodists as well, using these techniques, did expand into the towns and cities with some success. But this didn't solve all the problems. It created some problems because most of the city churches then had this cluster of satellite missions for the poorer areas. The missions was working out to reach more than just preaching stations. They were all-purpose relief stations, clothing societies, soup kitchens, and the like. With all these outside activities, it was really possible and easy to forget what was the true nature, what was the true purpose of the church, why are we here? The result of forgetting that purpose, that nature, was we developed this social gospel rather than a salvation gospel. The minister then became this organization man to put in these soup kitchens, these clothing stores together, this food bank together, rather than his job as a pastor of that local body of Christ. So then you had a lot of societies outside, maybe attached to, but really outside of the church, doing this whole galaxy of ministry activities. And they seemed to be getting out of control as they were starting to let liberal ideas and thoughts creep into their methods, creep into their way of doing things. And also at this time, the first rumblings of biblical criticism started echoing out from Germany, bringing up this idea of, is Scripture really true? Is it really a certain authority, or is it kind of just some guidelines? These things, I think higher criticism is called, that they start questioning, is this really something? So people started then, if we're not sure what our purpose is, if we're not sure that the Bible is our true authority, then where are we going to put our faith in? How about the church itself? How about the sacraments? How about the things that we do in the church? They are the things that we're concerned with and important. And I lost my place. Yeah. Also, at this time, started becoming a concern about opposition to slave trade that was starting to develop. And the British trade depended so much on slavery that intense opposition comes. So here you had another front for the fight to go on. And the abolition movement developed some new, reason of bringing this up, a new style of political opposition. Pressure group tactics. What you do with your propaganda or truth, whatever it may be, you spread this widely amongst the public, you impact public opinion, and then this public opinion impacts government officials. This was a new tool that they had found. We're always finding new tools, aren't we? But the Catholic Church response to this was they were forced to pay some attention, at least within their membership, to the social consequences of the industry, because it wasn't just Protestants that went to the factories. So Leo VIII, he encouraged the establishment of a Catholic Workers' Association as an alternative to the trade unions that were starting to be developed, and he condemned socialism, but he did recognize the responsibility of the employers to provide fair wages and good living conditions. But it still maintained this uncompromising stance toward their power, their prestige, and their authority. And his success, Leo's successor, Pius X, continued this reactionary tendencies of his predecessors. And in doing this, he broke off relations with France over France's anti-clerical laws. It didn't say what he did with Germany according to their Kulturkampf, but I'm guessing that that was a thumbs down as well as far as the papacy was concerned. Meanwhile, what did the Protestants do all this? As I said earlier, they had their soup kitchens, they had their clothing stores, and they had their aid to the poor and the needy. But much of the Protestant world was starting to explore this thing called ecumenism, leading to the formation of the World Missionary Conference, the Interdenominational Cooperation. This was promoted as the Evangelical Alliance, whose purpose was to enlighten Protestantism against the encroachment of popery and the interests of spiritual Christianity. Also at this time, the first branch of what was to become later the Young Men's Christian Association. I almost thought about doing but no. And also the World Student Christian Federation was brought together various university interdenominational groups. I think it was probably the start of the let's all just get along movement. That's my reference to the coexist bumper stickers. So, what does all of this have to do with us today? Many congregations, and I'm not trying to throw rocks, I'm just trying to state what we see out there in Christendom today. Many congregations, we see the harvest of the seeds of thought that were sown during this period in our church thinking. Many congregations see in the area of social reform, the church exists to feed the hungry, clothe the naked, house the homeless. Yeah, Christians are supposed to do that, but is that the prime purpose of the church? Political reform. The church needs to go to battle to get legislate morality, to get the proper people elected. Yes, Christians are supposed to be involved in the politics, but is that the purpose of the church? And then we get to the area of Scripture authority. We question Scripture. We allegorize Scripture. Liberal beliefs are brought into the church. They don't have it anymore, but I saw a sign, I won't point my fingers, in front of a church that was, "This is a religion for our time." Said it's not there anymore. I got a picture of it if you want to see it. And I thought, give them an A for truth. They were a religion for our time. Evolution, it's accepted. Creation is rejected. Scripture gets reinterpreted to accommodate for these millions of years, these long ages. Somewhere they need to fit in, so we will shoehorn them in somewhere. And we continue the myth that the dinosaur age was millions of years ago before man. All that death happened. Don, you're on the wrong topic. In Genesis, especially chapters 1 through 11, is regarded, these are just stories that's told to the kids to answer their questions because we can't think of nothing else. These are some of the things that you see in, and then that last one, when we were in St. Paul attending a Disciples of Christ church, we heard that pronounced from the pulpit by the minister. Genesis was just stories. Anyway, we need to understand where this thinking comes from. What's the background of it? What planted those seeds of that kind of thinking? Not to accept that thinking, but to understand where it come from, you're better able to talk to the person that has that kind of thinking to help nominal Christians become committed Christians, to firmly establish them into the biblical truth. And we need to avoid the errors of the past so we don't repeat them in the present. As I've said several times up here, this list is things that Christians should do, but are they things the church should do? And my answer is no. What the church should be doing is preparing the Christians to go do those things. Will you join me in a word of prayer? Father in heaven, as we look back over history, help us to see, to understand what the errors were. Help us to see and understand what the victories were and how you have worked through that century to keep the word of truth available to us today, that we can see what it is, and keep our eyes focused on our true meaning, our true purpose, and not to get caught up in those side issues that, yes, they're important, but they're not as important as us becoming conformed to the image of your Son, Jesus Christ, our Lord. Amen.